Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the mel0n Review. Today we're back checking out yet another very unique pad from KINGJADE, the KINGJADE Fuxi. This pad is quite different from the Torch Dragon I covered a couple weeks ago, as that pad was a non-balanced hybrid control pad that had surprisingly solid TAC FPS performance and a very unique surface weaving. The Fuxi on the other hand is a more normal pad in terms of its design, feeling more like a balanced control pad with the same slight differencing in the X and Y axis, the same base thickness, and the same overall quality of the Torch Dragon, but with a dual layered surface weaving that gives the Fuxi a very controlled focused performance profile. But we're going to talk about this unique surface weaving and the pad's performance and much more in this episode of the mel0n Review. But before we get into it, I did want to say a big thank you to KINGJADE for sending over the Fuxi for review. As always, this video will be fully subtitled and timestamps will be available down in the video description. And if you enjoy the review and want to see more videos like this, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed. Well, with all that intro stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. In terms of testing parameters for the Fuxi, I tested the pad for about 3 weeks, daily driving the pad for both work and gaming. I tested the pad at around 30 to 40 centimeter per 360, and I used the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Air Donuts, Air Jade Donuts, and the TGX Exact Skates over my testing. Now, in terms of the in-game performance here for the Fuxi, as I mentioned at the top of this video, the overall feeling of this pad is quite different from the Torch Dragon, despite the many similarities between these two pads. I'd say the Fuxi is one of the slowest pads I reviewed this year. The closest pad I can kind of compare it to in terms of its feeling would be the Raven Mori V2, but even when compared to that pad, the Fuxi still feels significantly more controlled, more akin to a mud pad. Due to its controlled nature, the Fuxi is best suited for X-axis aiming like the Torch Dragon was, but since the Fuxi's surface is so heavily control focused, despite the similar axis balancing between the two pads, the Fuxi lacks that slight range of dynamic Y-axis aiming that the Torch Dragon had, so the Fuxi trades that more dynamic aiming of the Torch Dragon for a more X-axis optimized and a more controlled experience overall. Because of this, the Fuxi felt best for games that have a heavy reliance on X-axis performance, so it felt best for games like Counter-Strike or Spectre Divided. The pad is usable for more dynamic aiming TAC shooters like Valorant, but because the pad is so controlled and so X-axis optimized, the more dynamic aiming required for Valorant is heavily hampered on this pad. But overall, the Fuxi, despite its high degree of control, is a great pad for TAC shooters and X-axis reliant aiming games. Definitely far too controlled for my personal taste, as I play a lot of dynamic aiming games, but I can see this pad being a fantastic option for mud pad enjoyers or people who want a heavy X-axis optimized pad. Now, in regards to unboxing, the Fuxi comes in the same packaging as the Torch Dragon with the same gorgeous packaging design. The pad is flat packed and the packaging is reusable, which is great to see. Inside the beautiful packaging, we have the pad itself, which is wrapped in a branded plastic wrapper. Oddly enough, the plastic wrapper is larger than the pad itself. I think this wrapper was supposed to go with the large size, not the medium version, but this is a pretty minimal issue overall. Inside the plastic wrapper, we have the Fuxi itself, which has this very vibrant red coloring. The Torch Dragon also had a beautiful coloring as well, and I'm very happy to see the same coloring style here on the Fuxi. Now, since the Fuxi is flat packed, I would avoid reverse rolling or creasing the pad as you could damage the pad's surfacing. The pad doesn't come with any kind of warnings about this, but just to be on the safe side, I'd be gentle with the pad so you don't damage it. Overall though, the unboxing for the Fuxi, just like the Torch Dragon, is quite solid. The only improvements I would suggest to the packaging would be ensuring the correct wrapper is used for the pad, as well as including a base cover like the one we saw with the Kurosan Samurai. That would make repackaging the pad for storage much easier, but this is a pretty minimal issue, and overall the unboxing for the Fuxi is quite solid. Alright, now in terms of sizing, the Fuxi is available in 3 sizes, just like the Torch Dragon was. There is a small, which is 420 by 300 by 4 millimeters, a medium, which is 490 by 420 by 4 millimeters, and a large, which is 500 by 490 by 4 millimeters. Today we're reviewing the medium size of the Fuxi. Let's talk about build quality and QC next. Just like the Torch Dragon, which was a very well built and QC'd pad, the Fuxi has the same level of overall quality, but with one similar mistake. In all honesty, the pad is pretty much perfect, the base is perfectly implemented, the surfacing is also very well implemented with no uneven areas or dead zones, the edge stitching is also very well implemented, but it does have the same weirdly stitched edge stitching. Again, I'm happy to see a double layered edge stitch as it does prevent fraying over time, but the edge stitching here on the Fuxi is a little wonky, for lack of a better word, and doesn't look the best visually, just like we saw on the Torch Dragon. I would love to see KINGJADE make their end stitching a little more like X-ray pad, so it's much cleaner and less eye-catching. Hopefully we'll see this cleaned up on the next version of KINGJADE's future pads. Now of course this wonky edge stitch won't affect the pad's performance at all, but visually it is a little odd. But overall the build quality here on the Fuxi is solid all around, just like we saw on the Torch Dragon. And to quickly clarify, some areas on my Fuxi's edge stitching look a little frayed and damaged. This isn't because of the pad's quality itself, it's because we have a new kitten whose name is Alphonse, by the way, and he loves to play with mouse pads and cables, so rest assured the pad's quality is fantastic. I just have a very sharp baby kitten who loves to play with mouse pads and cables. Alright, let's talk about the Fuxi's unique surface next. The surfacing according to KINGJADE is a double layer fabric with a velvet-like texture on the surface. The first layer is a fine velvet-like fabric, and the second layer is a sweat-resistant and moisture-wicking inner layer. Now I'll talk more about the Fuxi's inner layer in a bit, but let's focus on the surface layer first. Now the Fuxi surface is non-treated, so there isn't going to be any kind of work-in period on the pad like there would be on a heat-treated surface. To the hand, the Fuxi surface does feel velvetish, but there is a high degree of roughness to it, specifically on the y-axis. The pad surfacing also has this slight Velcro-like feeling to it as well. The surface is very hard to describe as it's quite unique, definitely velvetish, but also very rough and very controlled at the same time. Looking under the microscope, we can see the Fuxi surfacing is similar to the stitching of the Torch Dragon, being a wide-like weave, but the Fuxi surface stitching is much wider, taller, and denser than the Torch Dragon's. On top of that, the Fuxi's surface weave only runs along the x-axis of the pad on the negative x-axis, while the Torch Dragon surface stitching runs bi-directionally on both the positive and negative x-axis. Zooming out a little more, we can see the Fuxi surface stitch has that same raised linear design we saw on the Torch Dragon, where this dense Y-like surface stitch makes these ridges that run parallel across the surfacing of the pad across the x-axis. This is what gives the Fuxi that x-axis optimized performance I talked about earlier, as there's less resistance on the x-axis as you're moving along the raised surface stitching, while on the y-axis movements you will have significantly more friction as you're going against this raised stitching. In regards to the different types of friction felt here on the Fuxi, measured using the X-ray pad Jade Donut in the pad's default orientation and using a fingertip grip, the Fuxi's initial friction is surprisingly low, being around a 5 out of 10, the dynamic friction is much higher, being more around a 7 out of 10, and the braking friction is around a 5 out of 10. Now just like we saw in the Torch Dragon, the pad's softness is what makes the pad so controlled, not necessarily the surfacing, as due to its high degree of softness, you can push into the pad to drastically increase the initial dynamic and braking friction of the pad. So using a heavier grip like a palm or claw grip, the Fuxi's initial friction will drastically increase to more around an 8 out of 10 in terms of strength, while the dynamic friction increases to around a 9 out of 10, and the braking friction goes to around an 8 out of 10. Now keep in mind I'm also using speed skates for measuring the pad's friction right now. Using different types of skates like hybrid or control skates will increase the control of the Fuxi even furthermore. Now before I move on, I did want to make a quick note about tilting here. Since the pad surfacing is linear, you can shift the orientation of the pad by 90 degrees to shift the linear stitching to run up the y-axis of the pad instead of the x-axis, increasing the control you'll feel on the x-axis. But since all the sizes of the Fuxi are rectangular, so like the medium size I have here today, this trick can only really be utilized on the large size as it's the closest to a square. One last note I wanted to make regarding the surfacing here, due to the surface's kind of Velcro-like feeling and the raised ridge-like design, I did notice a lot of tugging issues with stock cables, as some cords paracords wrapping actually got stuck to the surface stitching. Now this only happened with a couple of the rougher cables I have, but it is something I wanted to note regardless, as you might have issues with this. Because of this, I would highly recommend using a mouse bungee when you're using the Fuxi, as any kind of rougher cable that does touch the surface does have the chance to get caught in the surface stitching. Next up, let's talk about the Fuxi's softness and control variability. Now since the Fuxi is 4mm thick, the same thickness as the Torch Dragon, the softness between the two pads is going to be pretty much identical, being similar to the softness you'd find on the X-ray pad Cerberus and the Infinity Mice Ruin or Shogun. Now the softness here on the Fuxi is the kind where you can kind of push through the pad and your downward force is stopped by what's under the pad, not the pad itself. The pad does have a quick rebound to it though, so if you do press very deeply into the pad, it does bounce back quite quickly. So as we've seen with many a super soft pad, the range of control variability here on the Fuxi is actually going to be much smaller than you would expect, as it's very easy to push your mouse too deeply into the pad, causing your mouse to bottom out. So while the range of control variability is small here on the Fuxi, just like it was on the Torch Dragon, there is enough range of control variability here on the Fuxi to make the pad much more controlled, which as I mentioned earlier allows you to increase the initial braking and dynamic friction significantly. Keep in mind that the skates you use and your grip style / weight will affect how much control you're going to feel here on the Fuxi, so your case may vary from mine. Now this high degree of softness does have some downsides when it comes to skate compatibility, so let's talk about that next. From my testing, dot skates, speed stocks, or smaller surface area stock skates weren't usable here on the Fuxi, as these skates were either too short or too small in terms of their surface area to counteract the Fuxi's high degree of softness, so the skates would sink too deep into the pad, causing my mouse to bottom out. We saw the same issues with these skate types on the Torch Dragon, and given the similarities between the two pads, this isn't exactly surprising. On the other hand though, full-size stocks with larger surface area stock skates like my Death Adder V3 stock clones I have here, or donut skates, worked perfectly fine here on the Fuxi, and despite my heavier hand and grip weight, with these skates I didn't have any issues with my mouse bottoming out on the Fuxi, which is great to see. In terms of what skates felt best here on the Fuxi, I found speed skates like the Extra Pad Jade Air Donuts and the glass skates from my opponent Stormbreaker to feel the best, as they cut down on the controlness of the Fuxi's surfacing and made the pad more usable for more dynamic aiming games like Overwatch 2, but control skates like the TGX Exact skates or the X-Ray Pad Obsidian Air Donuts also felt really good, as they really complemented the controlled nature of the Fuxi. These were the skates I used for Valorant and Spectre Divided testing the most, as they made the braking friction on the pad very consistent, so it was very easy to flick and stay on target. Now keep in mind that skate usage is entirely up to personal preference. As always, I recommend experimenting with different skate types to find what matches your personal aim style the best. Just be sure to use larger surface area skates or donuts here on the Fuxi, no dots, speed stocks, or smaller surface area stock skates. Alright, let's talk about the Fuxi's base next. The base here is the same Inui Poron base we saw on the Torch Dragon, which means it's going to have the same odd non-Poron-like performance as the base we saw on the Torch Dragon, but despite this weirdness to the Poron material, the base does still perform very well. The base to the hand isn't exactly sticky, but it anchors itself to desktops very well. The pad does rely on surface pressure to anchor itself, and it can take a little while for it to fully anchor, but once the base is fully anchored, it stays perfectly in place. Now, just like we saw on the Torch Dragon, despite the base being advertised as Poron, when it's exposed to moisture, it actually doesn't become sticky like Poron should. It actually becomes very slippery, which definitely makes me question again the legitimacy of the Poron claims here. And as I said in my Torch Dragon review, the base doesn't act like a Poron base does at all, and the base is the same style as we saw in the Fnatic-2, which was also another Poron base that didn't act like Poron at all. So again, I do question the legitimacy of the Poron base here. It's most likely a Poron-like rubber material, but despite the Poron branding here for the Fuxi, the base still does perform very well. Again, I wish I knew exactly what the base was. I don't think it's actually Poron, but regardless of the Poron material, it still performs very well. Let's talk a little bit more in depth about the Fuxi's edge stitching next. Now the edge stitching here is the same edge stitching we saw on the Torch Dragon, being a rounded edge stitch that's about equal to the height of the pad. The edge stitching's roundness does make it very easy to run your arm across or along the edge stitch, and it doesn't cause any significant additional friction, which is great to see. As I mentioned earlier, the QC on the edge stitching is perfect with no loose stitches aside from the areas where Alphonse got to it. It also has a dual layered end stitch, which I'm happy to see, but as I mentioned earlier, it's a little wonky and a little messy. It would be nice to see this cleaned up and a little more like X-Ray Pad's edge stitching, but this is a pretty minimal issue, and of course this is a purely cosmetic issue. It doesn't affect the performance of the edge stitching or the pad at all, but overall the edge stitching here for the Fuxi is very well implemented, just like it was on the Torch Dragon. The only thing I'd like to see improved is a bit of a cleaner end stitch, but again, this is a very minimal issue. And when it comes to the effects of moisture, as I mentioned earlier, KINGJADE is advertising that the Fuxi is a dual layered pad, and the second layer is a sweat resistant and moisture wicking inner layer. This is quite different from the waterproof surfacing we saw on the Torch Dragon, but as it turns out, the moisture absorption of the Fuxi is actually quite impressive. Adding some droplets of water onto the Fuxi's surface, you can see that the water beads on the surface for a moment and then drains into the pad's second layer. The Fuxi's water absorption here is very similar to the Zowie GSR2 or the Waco Island P87, just a little bit slower. Now, any area of the pad that does get waterlogged does slow down significantly, just like we saw on the Torch Dragon, but this is way more water than the pad would ever be exposed to, so this is a pretty minimal issue. Now, this does mean that the Fuxi is going to be widely resistant to sweat and humidity, and that's not going to significantly impact the performance here on the Fuxi. I would say in a very, very high humidity environment, you may run into issues, but for the most part, the surface layer will most likely be unaffected. This is a great improvement compared to the Torch Dragon, who suffered pretty heavily from moisture issues if any moisture did actually get into the pad. Now, since the Fuxi does have a rougher surface, the polar opposite of the skin-friendly surfacing we saw on the Torch Dragon, the pad's usability with bare arms isn't going to be ideal, as the surface friction is quite high against bare skin, and the roughness of the surfacing can agitate sensitive skin very easily. From my testing, I found the pad to be best used with an arm sleeve, as it helped to cut down the extra friction from the surfacing and made it a much more usable and smoother experience overall. So while you can get away with bare arm usage here on the Fuxi if you want to, I would recommend using an arm sleeve as it's a much better overall experience as opposed to bare arm usage. And lastly, let's talk about the effects of pet hair and dust. Now, due to the surface's tight weaving, just like the Torch Dragon, the Fuxi is largely immune to dust and pet hair. Anything that does land on the pad can be picked off or swiped off pretty easily. Sometimes pet hair can get stuck in between the linear kind of ridges on the pad surfacing, but I never had any issues with anything getting like stuck in the actual surfacing itself that affect the performance. So for the most part, the pad is immune to pet hair and dust, which is great to see. I also wanted to mention that despite the rougher surface, I haven't had any issues with dead skin or anything else causing any kind of slow spots on the pad, but I've only been using the pad for a couple weeks. Long-term usage with this higher friction surface, this might be an issue. Again, I'd recommend using an arm sleeve to prevent this, but if you do end up using the pad with a bare arm, I keep an eye out for this. Alright, well, in closing, overall the KINGJADE Fuxi is a very unique and quite interesting pad. Despite the similarities to the Torch Dragon, the Fuxi is like the polar opposite of that pad, being a significantly more controlled pad, more akin to a mud pad. I generally don't like super controlling pads, but I quite like using the Fuxi specifically for tack shooters that are more traditional. But for me, the fact that the pad isn't balanced on the X and Y axis is a deal breaker for me, as I prefer balanced axis pads. But if you're looking for a pad that's very heavily X axis optimized, that's great for more traditional tack shooters, the Fuxi is a great option. Just keep in mind this pad is very controlled and very mud pad-esque. If you want a similar X axis optimized experience but slightly faster with a little bit more of a dynamic range on the pad, check out the Torch Dragon. But overall, the Fuxi has quite impressed me, same as the Torch Dragon. I'll definitely be keeping an eye on KINGJADE's future products. Hopefully they'll make a balanced hybrid pad or a balanced control pad in the future, but we'll have to wait and see what KINGJADE cooks up. But that's going to be everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much again to KINGJADE for sending over the Fuxi for review. I greatly appreciate it. Big thanks to our channel members Yuki89, Prince, It Was Luck, and Lunars. Your support is greatly appreciated. If you'd like to become a member here and support what I'm doing here with the in-depth reviews and the Teardown project, you can become a member here on YouTube for only $2 Canadian a month. That is one of the best ways to directly support the channel, so thank you very much in advance for your support. You can also support the channel by using code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming Gear, TJ exclusives, and Mech Keys to save yourself a couple bucks off your order and help directly support the channel. Thank you again for watching my review of the KINGJADE Fuxi, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.